scenario planning workshop. I just want to introduce Jonathan Starr from Scenario Insight, I think is the name of his company. And I think a lot of folks around the table know the background on the scenario planning effort. It's been going on for 9 months to a year. There's been many meetings with commission members, stakeholders, and the 3 councils, New England, Mid-Atlantic, and South Atlantic Council. We're all working together. This is actually the first, I think, of the 4 management organizations that will be getting together as the whole organization to go through the scenarios, and Jonathan will give you more details on it, but go through the scenarios, and then over the next couple of weeks, Jonathan will be going to the 3 councils and running similar workshops with each of the councils. And some of you sit on the council and the commission, so you get to double dip a little bit, which is good. But you know, I think everyone knows the background. There's a lot of work has gone into this. A lot of time has gone into this. Tony and the others on the core team have spent, I don't know, a couple hours a week, I think, for the last 8 months or so, it seems like, trying to police. Longer than that, Tony, but who's counting? You know, pulling all this together. And we're at the point where, you know, these are as I said, the workshops for the management entities, and then ultimately the output of this leads into a summit that will take place early next year, and that's where the final recommendations and final you know, pieces will be pulled together. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let Jonathan take over and you know, coordinate and facilitate the rest of the afternoon for everyone. So Jonathan, it's all yours, and welcome.
I'm just going to say one thing real quick. If it's easier for some folks to follow along with the questions that we will be proposing to you all, I did make a couple of copies of both the draft scenarios as well as the outcomes of the manager sessions, and they are on the back table if you want those in front of you.
All right, Tony, thanks. Bob, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. I'm Jonathan Starr. I'm the moderator and the facilitator guiding the core team in this work on scenario planning. So I appreciate you giving up and allocating so much time on the agenda today to think about the elements of scenario planning, thinking about fishery management and governance in an era of climate change. And I also want to thank all the commission members for the preparation that you've done, either the kind of pre-reading that was put out in advance of this meeting particularly, or many of you might also have been involved in some of the earlier discussions throughout parts of this process. So very much appreciate your contributions to that. So I want to first say congratulations to the Commission on their 80th birthday or anniversary, whichever kind of term you want to use. And in some ways, it's quite relevant for the conversation that we're going to have today. In some ways, the purpose of this overall scenario planning event is to think about what will this Commission be concerned with and how will it be relevant and productive on its 100th birthday. So we're thinking 20 years ahead here. We're imagining that there are going to be changes and uncertainties that are going to be affecting fisheries, going to be affecting the way in which we manage, the way in which we kind of govern between our organization and others. But we don't exactly know how that's going to play out. But the more we can think about what's likely to play out in the next 20 years, the more successful we will be as a commission when we meet for the 100th birthday. So in some ways, that's what this session is all about. It's obviously there's going to be immediate concerns, there's going to be important things that you're going to be solving problems on a much more immediate basis. But what we're asking you to do today is to put a lot of the immediate concerns on the back burner and think much more about where is this commission, where are other entities in fishery management on the East Coast, how are we going to be preparing for the challenges of a decade ahead, the challenges of 2 decades ahead. And of course, we have this kind of particular angle here, really thinking about climate change. How is climate change going to affect the work that we do? That's really the kind of purpose of what we're doing here. Now, any attempt to look into the future is fraught with difficulty, and the main reason for that is we're not very good at predicting the future. We get surprised. It's complex. It's uncertain. There's no way in which we're going to kind of get everything together and get everything right. And so the reason why we're doing this approach called scenario planning is that it doesn't involve predictions. What it does involve is acknowledging that there is uncertainty out there and trying to identify a few almost reasonably plausible ways in which we can imagine the conditions on the ocean, the conditions facing fisheries are going to look like in the next 20 years. So just by means of definition, scenarios, the technique that we're using throughout this initiative, these scenarios, think about them as stories. They're stories about the ways that the world might turn out tomorrow. In our case, they're stories about the ways in which we might imagine the conditions facing fishery managers might play out tomorrow. And then we use these stories in a technique called scenario planning. We use these provocative stories about the future to help, if necessary, change the minds, change the actions of a group of people so that you are better prepared for, let's say, the world in 2042. And so our job today, our challenge today, is to try and think about those longer term ideas that will make your work, let's say, easier 20 years down the line. What do we need to start doing today to make sure that we are as effective as possible 20 years into the future? So I want to just start kind of formally now, the initiative objectives that has been going on for over a year. Two things that we're trying to do with this scenario exercise. We're exploring how East Coast fishery governance and management issues will be affected by climate change. And we're paying particular attention to the expectation that climate change is going to deliver and provide, in some ways, changing stock availability and distributions. What does that mean for fishery managers? What does it mean for governance? Secondarily, by going through this process, we're hoping to kind of promote, advance, develop a set of tools and processes that then ultimately provide this flexible and robust fishery management approach. And of course, the goals there are continuing to provide fishery conservation and resilient fishery communities, all within addressing uncertainty in an era of climate change. Let me talk a little about the timeline. We are over a year into this process and we've got a number of months to go, but we are really, I would say, the key point in this. We've spent the last year or so really developing a lot of the understanding of how climate change is likely to affect fisheries. Obviously, there's some things we understand, some things we can't know. We created a set of scenarios back in June of this year in a workshop session attended by 75 stakeholders up and down the East Coast from various different realms. And now the application phase is using those scenarios to help generate ideas that we think will help prepare fishery managers for the future. So we're going to go through, this is in many ways the kind of one of the early state parts of the application phase. And I'll explain that in a slightly greater detail. So we have over the past month, held a number of managers meetings back in September and early October. And those managers meetings provided us with early ideas about what we should be thinking about, what we should be concerned with, having seen the scenarios. You, in your pre-reading, had it's about a 5 or 6 page document providing you a summary of the ideas from that from those managers meetings, and we'll be asking you to maybe use that as a platform for the conversations that we have today. Then we're now into this second tranche of meetings, commission and council meetings happening over the course of today and then in early December, where we'll be meeting with each of the councils. The purpose there is to review the managers' meetings ideas and to generate your own. And then, as Bob mentioned, there will then be a summit meeting that we will hold in mid-February 2023, where all the ideas that you and the other councils will put into the mix, will then start reviewing them, prioritizing the kind of possible actions that emerge out of that. And then the process will roll on then kind of back to councils and commission for assessment of those ideas. So today's workshop, how are we going to spend our time today? Well, the first two bullet points really accord to the first half of the workshop, the second to the second half. We're going to ask you to review the scenarios that were presented to you in the pre-reading material. And they paint 4 different pictures of what 2042 might be like. We'd love your view and your perspectives and your reactions to those stories. You know, what do they speak to you about? And then we want you specifically to comment on the challenges, the opportunities, and the potential actions generated in that manager's summary. So again, that 5 or 6 page document that was presented. So they're the things that we'll do in the first half of the program. We'll take a break, and then when we come back, we'll have more of a, I would call a synthesis conversation, where we're identifying and discussing what you feel are the most important issues for the Commission to prepare for as climate change continues. And again, we'll set up that conversation with some slides. And then finally, we'll want you to identify what you see as the most important discussion topics that should be on the agenda at the February summit meeting. And so we will obviously take your ideas and recommendations into account. The other councils will be doing the same, and then we'll emerge with an agenda for that summit meeting in February. So let me just start by, or continue by reviewing the scenario framework that we created back in June and then subsequently developed with the help of a number of different stakeholders. I just want to explain here for anyone who hasn't been part of the process up until now. As I said, scenarios are alternative stories about the future, stories about things that might happen. And the way in which scenarios are constructed is through this concept of uncertainties, which are then represented by these 2 axes, both a horizontal and a vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, what the horizontal axis describes here is an uncertainty that says, in an era of climate change, here's one thing we don't know. We don't know how predictable conditions are likely to be, and we don't know how well science will be able to assess either those conditions or assess stocks and other things. In one version of the future, you might see a future where conditions are highly unpredictable, leading to maybe a low ability of science to be able to kind of predict and assess what stocks are doing or ocean conditions. Or maybe in 20 years' time, we might say climate change actually hasn't delivered a great deal of unpredictability. There might be some, but in general, maybe science is in a situation where we're feeling better about the ability that we have to assess and predict what's going on. So that's one uncertainty. You can see that on the horizontal axis there. The other uncertainty that people decided was particularly important for climate change was what happens to stock production. Are we going to see stocks that are mostly in aggregate maintained? Some stocks might well be increasing. Or are we on aggregate going to see stocks that are declining, maybe because of habitat degradation or other factors? Okay, so you put those 2 uncertainties together, and you get these 4 different quadrants, and these represent the 4 scenarios. Top left, stocks maintained but hard to assess or locate. Bottom left, stocks decline and hard to assess and locate. And you can see how it works around the different quadrants there. Each of them painting a slightly different picture for what we might imagine being the challenges that fishery managers are going to face. And I hope you can kind of recognize that there probably will be different challenges in each of these scenarios. In addition to that framework, it's also worth bearing in mind that even though we know that climate change is going to deliver a good deal of uncertainty, there are some things that we can probably count on, or some things we can be confident about. So we made a set of assumptions about, let's say, the next 20 years. Climate change is going to mean that ocean temperatures are going to continue to warm, and that is going to affect marine species biology and distribution. That's a given. That's in some ways what we're kind of assuming about all of this. And so every scenario is going to tell stories about how the biology and distribution of marine species is going to change. We also assume that there'll be regional differences in seasonal temperature changes and primary production changes according to different regions. So it's not as if we can tell a story that says exactly the same thing for all the different parts of the East Coast, right? Everywhere is going to be kind of slightly different, and we want to try and make sure that when we're ultimately thinking about the solutions, we're appreciating that there may well be differences. Sea levels, we'll assume that they will rise. We also assume that there will be changing ocean uses, creating more competition for fisheries, whether that be through alternative energy installations, aquaculture, maybe tourism and other things will be things that we expect the oceans to be busier, whether that's because of climate change or other things. We think that's something that we should bear in mind. And then finally, coastal populations growing, continuing, I guess, a trend of recent decades. We see no particular reason why that shouldn't be the case continuing on. So when we put all of those, let's say, kind of certainties together with the framework, we ended up with this scenario framework. Mentioned earlier about how to kind of describe the scenarios, and we told 4 stories. A story of ocean pioneers, and we'll go into the descriptions of these in a moment or two. A world there where stocks are mostly maintained or possibly increasing, but there's a high degree of unpredictability, low ability to assess. We kind of describe that world as one where the oceans are very busy. There's a kind of wild west of who quite doesn't quite know what's going on, and so it really is a challenge for management, because the science doesn't really lead to a lot of accurate assessment. However, having said that, there's plenty of production out there, and therefore there is still a lot of activity. Compound stress fractures on the lower left is a much more challenging scenario where you've still got the unpredictability, but also you've got stocks declining. And we'll talk about all the different kind of various challenges that are in compound stress fractures. Again, you might think about fishery managers having some quite significant headwinds facing them there. Sweet and sour on the bottom right, there is a world of predictable changes and a high ability to assess. The science is doing well, but the news is bad. Mostly we see stocks declining in a world like that, again, possibly because of habitat or other things. And then the top right, this in many ways is a kind of most positive kind of visionary scenario where we see stocks being maintained. They're not really affected too much by climate change. And then we do see kind of predictability in changes. So there's some aspirational elements to checks and balance. Okay, and so when we put these scenarios to the managers a month or two ago in the managers meetings, we decided to ask them a series of questions once they saw these scenarios about the types of solutions or the types of ideas that we wanted people to think about. Adaptability was one. The role of data and science in the future was the second. Alternative ocean uses and relationships with users was another one, and then cross-jurisdictional governance and management. So all 4 of these factors then became important descriptors and important factors that managers really did kind of provide suggestions and solutions around. I'd say. So that's really the end of the introduction. What I want to do now is to go through each of these scenarios in turn, asking for your reactions, suggestions, input to what you read about, what you've heard in my descriptions. We're going to take probably around 10-15 minutes per scenario going through all 4. So expect this kind of conversation now to last 45 minutes to an hour, something like that. Then we'll follow up with a couple of additional questions, and then we'll take some public comment and then take a break. So that's the first half of the conversation. We want to really go into each of these scenarios in turn, getting your reactions to what you've heard and to see whether you agree with what the managers have kind of proposed here and to see what your reactions are to them. But before I go into those, let me just see if anyone, this is a kind of workshop format, let me see if anyone has any questions about the about the description of scenarios that I've asked, that I've relayed, or anything about the work that we've done up until now in the previous months that I outlined here? John Clark, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. That's very interesting. But I'm just curious, did you also consider all these scenarios seem to rely on our current management structures still being in place, where we know the climate is changing, but we're also seeing unprecedented changes to governments across the world now. This kind of implies that everything that we do is going to remain pretty much the same as the climate change puts more pressure on governments, agencies, whatever. We've already seen growing, I'd say, lack of trust of what experts and scientists put forward. Is that something you're also considering in these scenarios?
John, thanks very much. Yeah, there's no doubt that we could have gone much broader in the description of the scenarios here and taken account of much more, let's say, political, broader social, broader economic developments. We felt that these were, they spoke to a focus on fisheries right now. What they do not necessarily assume that the current structure of governments and governance continues. And in fact, we will encourage you, and in all the meetings, if you think that there are particular organizational forms or particular challenges to kind of current organizations that you think some of these scenarios would say, you'd say, you know what, I see what we're doing at the moment kind of unsustainable because of, as you say, a trust in data or trust in science or a lack of it. We'd be more than happy to kind of take those things on board. So it's not that we're making assumptions that the status quo continues, kind of far from it. Lynn Fagley, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I haven't been totally engaged with this as we've gone along. So my question is on your access about predictability. It seems as though predictability is inherently impacted by data. So you could have a little bit of an off-ramp in your scenario if your data collection were to change. So let's say we get some awesome technology that allows us to use, drones or satellite imagery or, whatever new technology to really nail down some of the data that allows us to better predict. I just wondered if any of that was considered in the conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, you're right. We have conflated in some ways the predictability of the environment and in some ways the ability of science data to assess. Yes, you could imagine a situation, let's say a wild card, where you could be in a highly unpredictable environment and a major technology breakthrough comes along and could solve a problem or two. We felt that was a relatively unlikely scenario, although not implausible, an unlikely scenario, and therefore I would imagine that wouldn't be part of the kind of main four. But again, there's plenty of opportunity to think about advances in data and science in this. So I hope that at least in one of the scenarios we can think about that. Okay, Mel, we'll go to you, and then Adam to you. Mel Bell.
Yeah, thank you. Just kind of a nuance to where Lynn was going. So your ability to assess what's going on, certainly driven by the technology, your ability to collect the data that you need. And we struggle with that now. But one of the driving factors of that, of course, is what you can afford. So we're constantly limited by our ability to afford to use the technology to acquire the data. That exists now, but that sort of drives that as well. So there's that component to it, is your budget, basically.
Yeah, no, Mel, I appreciate it, and I think the scenarios probably do make some reference to budget constraints. And clearly, if you find there are scenarios where let's say, kind of trust and political trust is kind of ebbing away, the chances of getting more funding in those ones is kind of that much trickier. And so we do paint some pictures around that, but I appreciate you making that explicit there. Yes, thanks, Adam.
Thank you very much. Certainly, as we look forward towards this planning exercise for 100 years, and the existence of this commission is a very long time, but it's a drop in the bucket of how long these species have been here, as long we've been here, how long the planet's been here. So we're getting a very small snapshot in the last 75 plus years, and the next 20 years will be an even smaller snapshot. Our historic science and management has largely been predicated on a stability of environmental conditions. Obviously, we recognize that there has been change. That rate of change over the last couple decades has been predominantly in one direction. So we're working off of the assumption you listed on one of the previous slides that ocean temperatures continue to warm. As we look to the future, we've had discussion in this venue and at other councils as well about the need to make sure we have in place a process that allows for not just ocean temperatures warming, but changing. We want to set ourselves up so if this pattern changes, we have good scientific methods, good management methods in place. So now that this assumption is in here, is there a way to still adapt these scenarios and for us to provide input to make this a nimble enough process to be useful to us should we see environmental factors go in a different direction?
I would hope that the answer is yes. As we go through this, you will see that the outcome of any scenario planning process is to try and create flexibility and nimbleness in an approach to strategy. What you're trying to do is both identify factors that seem to work no matter what scenario plays out in future, but then also factors that you would imagine might be the most suitable things to do if conditions change out of any particular scenario. So even though we've made an assumption about ocean warming, the very fact that we're going through scenarios here, I think will encourage a flexibility, even if we see a scenario that feels out of our realm right now. That flexibility is still in there in the process. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to move us on now to talk more specifically about each of the scenarios in turn. And I'm going to spend a moment or two just describing very briefly what each of the scenarios are. Then I'll refer to a couple of the management suggestions that came up in the conversations a month or two ago, and then open it up for your reactions to that. So the Ocean Pioneer scenario, the first one that I mentioned, remember, this is a world where unpredictability is high, ability of science to assess is low, but you do have stocks maintained or possibly increasing. It's a world of crazy ocean conditions and weird weather, but the ocean stocks are resilient in this kind of world with necessarily no damaging climate tipping points. And therefore, whether it be through habitat or other things, we don't see significant die-offs of particularly important species. However, we are seeing that the seasons and the locations of traditional fisheries are changing and quite unpredictably. So traditional stock assessments are less reliable, and as a result, there is a greater demand for real-time data from vessels and maybe from other users becomes more valuable in a world like this rather than the traditional stock assessment modes. Ocean activity dominated by maybe some new players here, entrepreneurs, technology pioneers, and the winners and those who feel as if they're kind of having most influence. Maybe they're having, there's a capital intensity and deep pockets, there's new technology and a willingness to take risks in this kind of Wild West environment. Uncertainty about how long abundant stocks can keep delivering in a world like this. So when we put this Ocean Pioneer scenario to the managers, here were some of the let's say, headlines that they kind of reacted with. In some ways, in an unpredictable environment, climate change creating governance turf wars, requiring organizations to compromise on jurisdictional control. This question about the challenges of lack of accurate information, maybe decisions have to be made more on a qualitative basis. Maybe that the kind of the complexity of the environment might mean that we're prompting moves towards simpler harvest control rules, and then definitely a new set of opportunities here around vessels and new ocean users, offering opportunities for fish and environmental data collection. So, Ocean Pioneers is a kind of complex, fast-moving, unpredictable kind of Wild West world of a lot of activity going on, not necessarily all kind of going in a troubling way. It's just busier with kind of a challenge, particularly to kind of science and stock assessments. As you read through not only what's on this slide, but in the managers meeting, the report, do you agree with and do you recognize the kind of challenges that have been suggested for this particular scenario, and maybe some other things that you feel in a world like Ocean Pioneers, are there things that this scenario hasn't really covered, but you would think would be very relevant to bear in mind as we imagine the next 20 years? Let me open it up and see if people have reactions to this first scenario. Adam, yes.
Yeah, you might want to write that name down.
No, I'll remember it.
So the aspect of this sense of ocean pioneers and this sense of a wild, wild west, I think one of the things this scenario needs to encompass is that rapidly changing environment may not only be driven by environmental conditions, that economic, political decisions could be causing that to be created. A management decision that we make here around the table may move somebody out of a fishery and allow somebody else to come into the fishery. That if it wasn't for the management decision we made here around the table, the environment would not have driven that to occur, for example. So I think that's what struck me most about this, is that I can recognize, I can relate to an environment like this, but I can't relate to it solely on a factor of environmentally changing conditions.
Okay, Adam, thanks. So in some ways you're describing that decisions almost appear to be more consequential, let's say, in a world like this. Is that kind of one of the ways to interpret it? Okay, yes. Jim Gilmore, thanks.
And it was kind of follow along what Adam said. And if you go back to the last slide, and what I thought was missing, and Adam hit it, was the political part of this. So let's take the ideal world, the upper right corner. We have the best data, we know what's going on, whatever, and we still have major battles getting things accomplished because of the politics of it. You throw it into this quadrant. This is right for us sitting together, every council, every manager, coming up with what we should do. But because it's gray and the data is gray, the political machine is actually what makes a decision on it. So that's the, and I'm just thinking about, I've been around a few years, and I go back to governor and interstate committees I've been on for climate, actually storm recovery, those types of things. And the minute we get into gray data, politicians just make a decision and don't consider any of this other than what you said. The winners typically have deep pockets, sharp elbows, new technology, and the politicians. So that's the part that I think is missing, that struck me as, well, we could really maybe figure this out, but completely fail because of that last piece.
Jim, thank you.
Yeah, Mike, sorry, I don't have a name tag, but for those of you I've not met, I'm Mike Ruccio from NOAA Fisheries Service. It's nice to see a lot of you again, first time in person for me. One of the things that really struck me with this one is, inherently it seems like there's a lot of flexibility to move through fisheries to kind of chase fish as these scenarios unfold, particularly in this quadrant. And our existing permit and regulatory structure doesn't really allow that type of operational flexibility. So that might be something, you know, if this is a scenario that we envision taking place, it's not necessarily governance, it's actual, you know, who has the rights to fish for certain things, and be able to embrace some flexibility around those types of operations to allow exploitation in this way.
Any other thoughts or reactions on input to this one? Justin, thank you.
Thank you. So the statement under this scenario that, you know, traditional stock assessments are less reliable, and I think on another slide it said something like, you know, stock assessments are essentially not like, you know, traditional stock assessments are unlikely to work anymore. You know, I'm thinking about the stock assessment process broadly. There's inputs, you know, the fishery dependent and fishery independent data that are collected. There's the assessment process itself, you know, scientists who work for different government entities take those data, use different statistical techniques, apply to them, and you know, then there's the sort of outputs, you know, estimates of current population states, and then predictions about future population states. What parts of that are expected to break down here? Like, you know, that statement, traditional stock assessments are less reliable or won't work, seems pretty broad. And I'm just kind of curious, you know, what's the part of it that we think is going to break down under this scenario?
I think I remember this, Justin, and I think that it's the unpredictability of the environment. While we still are getting data, the fast changing environment, the assessments aren't actually giving us good information with how the species are responding to that changing environment. I think I'm remembering that correctly.
Justin, can I ask you, would you, as you read this, would you see a difference between the different elements that you would identify? Would there be some that would come under more pressure than others in a world like this?
Yeah, I just sort of wonder whether, you know, if the fish are moving around more than they do now, if it's less predictable, environmental conditions are less predictable, so maybe recruitment varies more widely. You know, I wonder if the assessment process might still work okay in terms of telling us things like current biomass or current mortality, but it just might be less predictive. You know, if we change measures this way, where will we end up in 5 years? I think just sort of the predictive power might change, but I really wonder whether we would really be that handicapped at assessing where things currently are. And what that means for the management process, I'm not quite sure. I haven't worked through, but just wanted to explore that a little bit.
Okay. I think the other thing that certainly when the groups created this scenario originally, they spent a lot of time thinking about the role of more real-time data assessment from vessels or other installations. And again, I can't give you the details of that, but a sense in which, in a world like this where the ocean is busier and people are looking for things in a more, let's say, real-time or short-term way, would there be a challenge to, let's say, look, there are other ways of collecting data, and they appear to be either just as accurate, if not more accurate, than some of our traditional methods. And I think that's part of the challenge that we saw in Ocean Pioneers. Are there, let's say, kind of competitive ways of finding data? Okay. Dan Kiernan, please.
Yes, thanks. Jim Gilmore had mentioned political forces, but I guess I would broaden that to include the courts. So what we're facing with right whales is obviously caused by climate change, but it's the courts that are probably going to bring about the, you know, to enforce certain laws that are going to be wreaking the most havoc. It made sense to me because I'm actually dealing with a very difficult group of fishermen calling themselves the pioneers for peaceful coexistence in Mass Bay, who want to fish ropeless gear because they call themselves the pioneers. And it's all about the deep pockets because this gear is very, very expensive. And we're all wondering who will finance it. And I'm personally concerned that we're going to lose the owner operator, mom and pop style of business in this lobster fishery, because in order to compete, you're going to have deep pockets and take risks. So it's spot on.
Dan, thanks very much for that. Jason, next to you, please.
Thanks. So I'm going to start by saying I'm feeling my way. I'm not entirely sure I'm sort of giving you the feedback that you're actually looking for, but I'll give it a shot. In this, I'm going to go back to what Justin was saying, and then it actually popped into my head with Lynn's question earlier. And so I accept the premise that some kind of technology is going to come out of the ether and sort of save us here. But I do think we have existing tools. I'm thinking about this stock assessment, traditional stock assessment comment in the bullets here. And, I think we have progressive assessment techniques. They exist. So it's not like something has to be developed. They're here already. We don't tend to use them much yet because there hasn't been the kind of prompt to really push us into using these. I think we're actually headed in that direction. I'm talking about like state space techniques, spatial assessment techniques, things like that. They exist. And so this being in this scenario could be the impetus to kind of push us into using those more regularly. And so I don't know that we will lose this ability to kind of understand the populations of the resources that we care about. I think, we could understand them. We'll just need to use different tools, again, that already exist.
Jason, thanks very much for that. And that's a great example of the role of scenarios. If we see by dint of kind of indications that we might be moving more towards a world like Ocean Pioneers, knowing that in advance or having a sense in which we're moving in that direction, having had this conversation, we might say, you know what, we've already got some tools that really need to be, emphasized or pushed a little more. So I think it's a great example of how we can use the kind of the almost rehearsing the future idea to kind of say, okay, can we get ahead of this?
Having that adaptability within the metrics, which gets back to questions of budget and techniques as they develop and all those other things. I mean, they're all interrelated.
Chris, thanks very much. Last comment, I think Joe Cimino.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just kind of stay on this because I've heard some of the earlier discussions that were putting this together, and I think a big part of the discussion too was less of a concern in the modeling, but more an idea of how we handle biological reference points. And there was a lot of discussion about productivity and not knowing what those changes are going to mean to us. So the idea that we have to start facing facts in these scenarios where we don't understand what the productivity level for these species is anymore. So our old goals that we were trying to achieve may not be achievable anymore, and having those difficult discussions, or vice versa, that we now have a stock that's actually benefiting from the changes, and we're actually kind of just stuck in a place that's lower than we should be thinking about where the stock should be.
Joe, thanks very much. Okay, everyone, I'm going to move on. I've got a number of scenarios to kind of cover off here. I'm going to move to the second one, compound stress fractures. So as we move around the matrix, you can see the little icon there in the top right-hand corner. We're going from the top left to the bottom left, and so we're still in a world, or we're still imagining a world in the next 10 or 20 years where the unpredictability is high. Assessments, for the reasons, and some of the reasons that you've already identified, still struggle. And yet this is also a world where we're finding that stock production replacement is declining, whereas in the previous scenario it might have been maintained or enhanced, it was just in a different place. Now we're seeing, or we're having evidence that stocks seem to be declining, and that seems to be the evidence on the water as well. So compound stress fractures, is painting a picture that none of us particularly want to envisage, but it's important to kind of imagine things like this. So unpredictable conditions creating negative impacts to marine species. Maybe this is a world where we are going to see significant climate tipping points. It might involve die-offs and so on. Pollution might play more of a role here, affecting estuaries and nearshore habitats. You might imagine that this might be a world of kind of severe marine heat waves and so on as well. Harvest opportunities falling due to the low abundance in this world. And then people talked about if we were facing this kind of situation, would operators then need to shift effort to lower trophic level species? We've already described a world where science is in some ways feels as if it's kind of unable to help stock assessments, relying on insufficient data as we've just described. And I think in some ways the main difference, or one of the main differences between this and the Ocean Pioneer scenario is that in compound stress fractures, there is a large degree of frustration and possibly a lack of trust between different stakeholder groups, because it does feel as if the kind of resources are that much more strained in a world like this. You might imagine that the challenges here might mean that government steps in to save a few domestic fisheries, but fishing no longer kind of feels like the dominant activity in the ocean, competing with other industries for space and attention. And so this clearly is a much more kind of problematic world to imagine. People in the managers sessions here talked about different approaches to management. Is this where we're kind of managing spatially or by species or both? The need for adaptability in some ways was never higher than in this scenario. So can you give fishermen who are specializing the opportunity to move up and down the coast, or fix fishermen the ability to move from one species to another? How do you respond when reliable indices for managed species are no longer reliable? And then the need to kind of collaborate with other users, again, for real-time monitoring, as we described in the other scenario. So compound stress fractures, again, questions: do you recognize the challenges, the opportunities, the potential actions? And let me just give you fair warning: whenever we've introduced this scenario in managers' meetings or in other things, there is usually a period of about 30 seconds where there's a stunned silence and no one really wants to talk first. So I will appreciate anyone who wants to kind of start our conversation here and give it a go. Okay, Steve Crane, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And to say I'm enjoying this wouldn't quite be the right statement, but it's teaching me something. To speak on this compound stress fractures, I almost need to compare it with the last one. I think most of the people here at this table know what to do in this situation as managers. This is something that we've seen, maybe not at these conditions, but to the stock, we've seen this happen. Northern shrimp's a good example. But you don't know exactly what to do right away because you don't believe it's not an isolated thing, but you catch up and you know what to do. It's the politics that slow up everything down. But when you have what you called ocean pioneers, which could be a very healthy resource, but you don't know it because you don't know where they are, having those two possible scenarios in your notebook, it's almost like the ocean pioneers could be used as a tool to delay management in this type of scenario, because people would use that. Well, you don't know that this is it. We will find them. We heard that about shrimp. We will find them. Don't worry. Let us go. So I'm not trying to hope that we have horrible situations to manage, but it's the obvious bad situations we can figure out how to turn around or try to turn around. We can come up with solutions. It's the ones we don't know are bad yet, because there may be a possibility they aren't. It's just my opinion.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, great point. I appreciate it. Yes, I can't. Is that Roy? Roy Miller. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Steve's comments and just mention that there are species that we categorize as depleted in our annual review of species stock assessments. And some of them, and I'm thinking specifically of species like weakfish, perhaps winter flounder, and others that perennially we classify as depleted. And we've made overtures in the past to put conservative management in place for these species, and yet they don't recover. And they don't recover to levels that we observed in our working lifetimes. And it's frustrating. So I hear what Steve is saying about species that perhaps we know what to do. There are other species that we attempt to manage that, frankly, we throw up our hands at this point and say we're unable to figure out why this species is not recovering or even why it collapsed in the first place. Thank you.
Roy, thanks very much. Other thoughts on Eric Reed? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. So, we went from ocean pioneers who have deep pockets and access to technology, and now, but we keep talking about our same traditional stock assessment methods, and now we're talking about traditional stocks that may not help us anymore. And your second bullet talks about the opportunity to move up and down the coast. I'm not really interested in moving up or down the coast. I'm more interested in moving away from the coast. Current management now basically prohibits most bottom tending gear, depending on where you are up and down the coast, anywhere from 450 to 600 meters. And there are fish that live out in the deep water. Whether you can catch them with a midwater trawl or a long line or with pots or something. Right now, the vessels don't exist on this coast. Right now, your permits are restricted to, I think it's 165 feet long and 3,000 horsepower, and that's not going to cut it out in 500 fathoms of water. So, I look at ocean pioneers or entrepreneurs who have access to technology and capital, which was what we were going to need to fish out in the deep water. But, I see it. We're going to be fishing on fish that we don't even catch now. Fish like roughy and neon flying squid. I mean, cephalopods are a climate change winner at this point, and things like hoki. So, we don't manage any of that stuff, and half of you don't even know what they are, I bet. But that's where we're going to be headed. And, certainly ocean pioneers would fit right into this scenario because they're the ones that are going to give it a shot. But we're going to need help from the government, for sure. And we're going to need help from managers to figure out what's out there. And what that will do is it'll take some of the pressure off the inshore fleet by possibly moving effort of much bigger boats than we have now offshore to still catch seafood for the American public and probably for the world as well, and maybe give some of the relief to the inshore fleet. So I'm not necessarily saying there's all losers here. I think that there's winners, but I think it's going to be a vastly different product mix, which is going to require new infrastructure and marketing. So that's kind of where I'm blending the two together. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. And we'll definitely come on later. There's clearly a lot of parallels between these two on the left-hand side. Adam, and then Jason. Adam.
I think we could all agree that there are elements of all these scenarios that we could relate to today in some capacity. And while I don't think most of us around the table would believe we're at a breaking point in the environment, which starts out the first part of the narrative, I found myself surprisingly relating to more statements in this narrative than any of the other narratives as I went through these. Under these conditions, habitat declined. Fishermen need to change stocks. Estuaries experiencing declines. I mean, I can go through these science not able to predict. Scientists and managers learn to use novel real-time data streams. The costs of harvesting fish continue to rise and profit margins shrink. I could go on and on. The first sentence of just about every paragraph here I relate to as what I'm living as a manager and as a fisherman. That's really scary. You know, you want to talk about a shock level setting in of what might be. I think a greater concern is, are we living some of this now? And again, some of it for different reasons, not that we're at a breaking point. I think most of us are all here because a lot of us are very resilient. A lot of us around the table are very imaginative. We've got access to resources, both scientific and the fishermen we work with. So again, I don't agree that we're at a breaking point, but I just found myself surprisingly drawn to so much of this, and that gave me a lot of pause. I'm not sure what the takeaway is, but I would really love to hear if there were other reactions to that in other venues you've had this at, as well as around the table today.
Okay. Adam, thank you. And just to give fair warning, at the end of our going around all four of these scenarios, I'm going to ask for a very informal poll, just as to which of these scenarios, in the same way as Adam, you've just identified, which of these scenarios do you kind of feel best represents what we see today, and which scenario do you feel is most likely from your perspective be the one that plays out in 2042? So kind of fair warning about that. We're not going to, it's just indicative, and it's just kind of interesting to see how people's reactions are to that. Let's get a couple more comments on compound stress fractures, and then I want to move on to others. Jason, over to you.
Thanks. Thinking a little bit about the comment on, the population decline, just like with, chemicals, if you're trying to measure a chemical, your instruments are only good down to a certain level, and then they reach this level of undetectability. We have the same thing with fish populations, right? As they decline, we get to a point where progressive tools are not, there's just not enough information out there to sort of understand the populations anymore. And so what I'm suggesting here is that that's one of the, trying to, if we're being Jedis here and we're thinking out in front of things a little bit, figuring out, we've not been good at this because this has happened in some situations. So thinking of ways to manage the species that have dropped below these detectability levels is kind of another thing we should think about in this type of scenario. And then one other quick comment on the second bullet up there. This notion of flexibility, I think, is critical in this scenario. So that's the, I see that second bullet as like flexibility. I think it actually holds, I think it's generic. It doesn't have to be, I think that's good across all of the scenarios. So a super important concept in this scenario for sure, but also in some of the other ones as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move us on to our third scenario here. So we're now in a world in the bottom right that we've called sweet and sour, and the sweet and sour element really refers to the fact that the science is good, but the news is bad. So here's a world where we have more either predictability in conditions, either because of that or for other reasons. The science and the assessments are that much more accurate and more predictive. However, they're more predictive, and then they're basically telling a story about declining productivity and abundance, a smaller maximum fish size. We're imagining here the kind of ranges are shifting as they are in all of the different scenarios. And so there's a kind of predictability in a kind of the range shifts as species move north and east. The sweet and sour also refers in some ways to the fact that you do see some management arrangements in places where challenges are addressed by improved forecasts and kind of better fishing community innovation, and then successful fishermen adapting to reduce catch limits and new stocks in a world where productivity is declining. The sour part of that is some of the regions struggling to develop effective responses to these challenges. That may well lead to fleet consolidation, loss of markets to imports, and declines of historic fishing communities. We also, in this scenario, played up ocean uses are big in all of the scenarios. Aquaculture was one that we felt was particularly kind of important to outline and say that this was a big development in this scenario of sweet and sour. So managers, as they reacted to these ones, they talked a lot about how when you have a little more time, maybe the changes aren't as abrupt. Is there an opportunity to work through solutions to determine best approaches before formalizing changes too quickly? And this is relating particularly to kind of governance arrangements. More attention placed on what are the strategic choices around declining stocks. With the science in a good place, how do you kind of further develop climate-informed status reports like the state of the ecosystem assessments? And then questions there or opportunities there around about aquaculture products. As our aquaculture increases in popularity, what are the kind of complementary or kind of contrasting ways in which we can increase efforts to market wild caught seafood? So, and there are a number of others, as you'll see in the manager summary to this. So, thoughts on sweet and sour, a world where maybe there's more predictability, maybe the science is relied upon more, it's trusted more, and yet we're seeing the future and it probably looks a tough set of conditions as stocks are likely to decline and productivity is going to decline. How did people read this scenario, and any reactions to either the scenarios or the ideas in the management report? Someone wants to get out of here. Yes, Lynn.
I'm going to preface this the same way Jay did a little while ago. I don't know if this is the input you want, but I just am looking at, the second bullet, which is deliberately making strategic choices around declining stocks and, our reference to stock. And I wonder if in the conversation there was any discussion of a phenomenon like fishing down the food web, right? Where we're just holistically switching either in this scenario or possibly in the compound stress fracture scenario where we're, we suddenly have an awesome, tunicate fishery for Magula in Chesapeake Bay, and people love eating tunicates because we're, the top predators are unpredictable and hard. So we're really having this economic and cultural shift toward eating other things based on what's available to the fisheries. I just wondered where that fits.
Yes, we did talk about that. I think more in compound stress fractures, but yes, we did talk about fishing further down the food web.
I think, Lynn, for this one, on that second bullet, we were sort of playing out a scenario where some regions were making some really smart choices and using advancements to be assets, and other regions were not. And so that's sort of what we were, trying to play out here, where the management bodies were not all behaving in the same way.
Mike, thank you.
I think one that struck me as I looked at this scenario is, it's enviable in some regards because we have good information. But what seemed to be missing for me is that good information often has a cost. And if our resources are starting to decline, would we still expect the level of investment that we would need to maintain that adequate science? Stated another way, if stocks have declined to the point, why would we still have the robust research and management programs that we have today, and might forego that and see a degradation of that on the science side?
Okay, thanks, Mike. And in some ways, Jason, your point of earlier around the kind of if stocks are declining, would that automatically mean a kind of a trickier let's say, method to assess them, somehow we've solved that problem in this scenario, if you imagine it playing out. Yeah. Eric, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Starr. To Mr. Ruccio's point, some hard decisions are going to have to be made because, stocks that are declining become choke stocks and they affect the ability to prosecute a lot of other fisheries. At some point, management is going to have to just walk away from those stocks for socioeconomic reasons, environmental reasons. I mean, northern shrimp's a great example. Are northern shrimp ever coming back? Well, I don't really know. They're not necessarily a choke stock, but yellowtail flounder is a choke stock, and I don't know if those are ever coming back. So these are decisions that are going to have to be made on whether to continue a management regime for fish that you should walk away from, and then let other fisheries that are more successful be prosecuted and not worry about whether you catch the last yellowtail or not.
Thank you. Adam.
One of the debates we've had around this table is we've dealt with some species in decline is answering the question of, do we let the fishing community and markets play out, and they're going to go ahead and dictate effort in the fishery at that point? And therefore, is there a point of overmanagement that's occurring as those stocks are just no longer available? So I think that's something that's worth adding somewhere in here. Is that consideration that for certain depleted stocks, the fishery itself will just move on to something else? The cost of going ahead and harvesting it just won't be palatable anymore. And those people that do choose to remain in the industry will be no longer affecting the population that has a biological consequence in keeping it at a low level. It's now almost entirely environmentally driven.
Thank you very much. Jason.
Thanks. I was thinking about the last bullet on here, and the first part of that. So it's aquaculture products increase, and what kind of popped into my head is, as aquaculture products increase, so is I guess in a de facto way, the space that the aquaculture farms or what have you, they're taking up more space, right, to produce more yield. And so that will exacerbate some of the already existing user conflicts, space issues that we see with aquaculture currently. So I wanted to make sure that kind of aquaculture increasing has a benefit, but there's always a trade-off, right? So the trade-off is, they'll be taking up more space and increasing some of that kind of public trust conflict that already occurs.
Jason, thanks very much. Okay, so let's move to the last scenario, and actually the previous comment I think has a relevance here as well. So checks and balance is the scenario up on that top right hand corner, where we're really talking about a world where there is a degree of predictability, the science works, but also we have a kind of sense in which stocks are not affected in particularly damaging ways by climate change. And so there are predictable changes, tolerable conditions. Clearly, we're making the assumption that stocks are moving around, and so you are going to see the range expansion here as stocks kind of move north and east. But basically, here's a world where there's a lot of attention being paid to climate change. Obviously, okay, maybe emissions may well be kind of peaking or going down. That's not going to necessarily affect things within 20 years, but things like better pollution reduction, habitat protection, and restoration are starting to reverse habitat damage and loss. Science capacity booming. In a world like this, effective ocean monitoring, real-time catch reporting, bycatch avoidance, all the things that we think, these are good things that we're seeing starting to happen. But this is a busy world. The oceans are busy. There's investment in other ocean and coastal uses, leading to competition. To the point Jason made, aquaculture for space and so on. But also it could lead to collaboration, where you might see fisheries science being boosted by tracking data in wind energy installations. The other concern in this world, I think, is concerns over accessibility, where if the coast gets busier, if the ocean gets busier, then are we going to see challenges here to, or challenges of gentrification creating concerns over accessibility and questions of environmental justice? So when managers looked at this scenario, they definitely had an idea of the important things here are focusing on access and participation from small fleets and low-income recreational fishermen. The question here in a relatively predictable world, is this where we're jointly managing stocks because we have good data rather than switching from one management body to another? This is a world where there is a lot more emphasis on new technology, maybe other kind of advances like biological sampling in ports. And then the question here, again, in a very, very busy ocean environment, how do new ocean users have a seat at the table for all the different kind of ocean management issues, whether it be fishery management or other things? How do you collaborate and connect with other ocean users? It's going to come up in some of the other scenarios. It certainly loomed large in this one. So checks and balance, you know, the picture that's painted here is one of in some ways activity and buoyancy and getting a lot of the kind of decisions right, but certainly there are some challenges and downsides to it as well. How did people read this one and be interested in any reactions? Did we get important aspects of this, you know, into the storyline, or would you say there are other things we need to bear in mind on this one? Jason.
Yeah, I like this is where I want to be. This one's cool. You know what though, as I was reading the last bullet there, I kind of, as optimistic as I like to be, this is kind of a grumpy comment, but and it's based on kind of current experience. So, you know, the bullet says, consider how new ocean users have a seat at the table. The experience has been the new ocean users have the seat and the existing ocean users were the ones looking for the seat. So, you know, I think it's not always, I think that has to do with, you know, means and things like that. So, you know, just that could be reversed in some instances. So, but maybe it's, you know, some sort of collaborative effort of all users figuring out how to make that work. And I think the issue is, as new industries kind of come into the ocean use game, they just don't know, you know, oh, there's a bunch of people working there already. That's, you know, they didn't know. We'll just take them at their word about that. But it's kind of making space, figuring out ways to make sure we all know who's there and making sure everybody gets a voice in the process is important.
We have a comment from Tom Fody on the webinar, please, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to make this one earlier, but I'm really thinking about looking at these, and I always say old ocean users, like the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, they have effects on.
Tom, we can't hear you right now.
I unmuted myself.
Try again.
Can you hear me? I guess not.
I still can't hear you. Your mic is running. I see that you're talking, but it's not coming through.
Okay.
Hold on one second. Sheree, can you test your mic for me? Sheree Patterson, will you give me a test? And Tom, if you'll close your mic.
Okay.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
All right, Tom, we'll come back to you. We'll stay in the room. Somehow we've lost our ability for the webinar to talk to us. So give me a hot minute.
Okay, let's see if there's any other comments in the room for now on this checks and balance scenario. Let's go to Doug first, please, and then to Pat. Doug.
Yeah. I know, always trying to trick me. Thing that I looked at this, and where Adam thought was scenarios, compound fractures is where we are right now. I think this is where we've been in the past. We talk about joint management of stocks. We've been doing that. We had a lot of new technology we were trying to work on. Port sampling, biological sampling, we've been doing that in the past. Participation from small fleets and low-income recreational fishermen. We've been here before. I guess it would be wonderful to figure out how we can get back to this.
Thanks, Doug. Pat?
Yeah, thanks. The last bullet with new ocean users, it's really been an interesting process we're going through in Maine with the expansion of aquaculture, new users. I mean, it's a very busy field right now. But what that is bringing in is people who want a seat at the table, but they want a seat at the table for a very different reason, right? It's the not in my backyard folks who are trying to influence the process. So I think as we're developing and dealing with these challenges, we need to make sure that it's based on the process, that it's based on the science that we need, and not based on just people who are opposed, right? I mean, I think having that good, we need to encourage new users, I think, being at the table, but we have to make sure we do it in a controlled way, that it's just not to stop something that's changing for the future based on the needs of the climate, changing climate.
Can you hear me from this?
Pat, thank you very much. Yes, John Miller. Oh no, next one.
Roy Miller.
Roy, sorry, Roy, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to look at the second bullet point up there for just a second. I think we've made some strides in terms of joint management with both the councils, our federal partners, and the commission, but I think we've got a ways to go. I think that joint management could be streamlined. Too often we find ourselves at odds where Magnuson-Stevens Act becomes an impediment to us and a mandate to some of our partners, our federal partners, our council partners. And so I think we have a ways to go on that particular bullet point in order to keep us in this sphere of the checks and balances and not drop back to the compound fractures. Thank you.
Thank you. John Clark, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Just looking at all these, one thing that strikes me is we're all relating to the future with what we're thinking, what we've seen now or in the past. And, you know, as we know, what we think is going to happen in the future is probably not going to be that way. And especially some of the scenarios that try to factor in, you know, a very dystopian future, but you know, things could be much, much worse than this. And it's just so hard to tell where we'll actually be. I mean, even now, if we just look back, as Roy said, when wheatfish first started to decline, we thought we knew the answer. We just do what we did with striped bass. We'll just cut back harvest, and here they come, and they haven't come back. Opposite side, something like horseshoe crabs, where, you know, when I started, who would ever have thought we'd even be managing horseshoe crabs, let alone having it become an international issue. But, you know, those are the type of things that happen. I mean, I just see some of the things happening out in, you know, sort of the unregulated fisheries of the world now, where you have this huge amount of effort going into countries like China that are putting these huge fleets out there that are just decimating fisheries in other countries because they have the power to do that. And, you know, once again, this is a great exercise, but there's so many unknowns that, you know, as the old joke goes, you know, we expected flying cars and instead we got 140 characters about where we are now with technology. So just hard to tell.
Yeah, and $7.99 a month as well. Yeah. Okay, I think there was one, was it Jim Gilmore, thank you.
A basic ecological principle is carrying capacity, and looking at the fourth bullet, it's one thing that we're struggling with at New Year's is, well, what's the carrying capacity that we have, and how much more could we put into the system? And that's something that would be very difficult. And right now, you know, regardless of what you're trying to do, all right, the wind companies came in and they're saying that, you know, the fishing community is saying they're taking away our harvestable area. So that is their capacity to add them on. And the mindset now, we just in the last couple of years tried to do some modest expansion of artificial reefs. I mean, to the point of 0.001% of the ocean. And the commercial fishing industry were like, you're taking away our livelihood. But again, you don't know what that carrying capacity is. So if it was some factor and then you say, well, we're only taking away a minor percentage and wind farms are only taking it, and aquaculture and bigger ships and, you know, go on and on and on. So we've all gone through these spatial planning exercises, at least a lot of us have. But it really doesn't, it kind of tries to carve a pie, but you don't really know what the capacity of the pie is. So anyway, I don't know what the answer is, but until you really get some sense of what the capacity is for the whole resource, it's going to be very difficult to get to at least the last bullet and probably a lot of them. Thanks.
Jim, thank you.
All right, Tom, let's give it a try.
Can you hear me?
Okay, it's still not working in the room. I think I know what it is. We added a mic, and I'm going to take it away at the break. So hopefully at the break we'll fix it.
Okay.
Sorry, Tom.
All right, no worries. Okay, just a couple more comments, and then we're going to thank you for going through all of the scenarios. We'll go one short exercise, and then we'll do some public comment, I presume, with people in the room rather than online, and then we'll take a break and try and fix this. Eric Reed, please.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. So if we go down the bullets, I mean, this is the, you know, everybody wants to be in this place, but I'm a little bit concerned about the first bullet. So can you remind me whether a small fleet is small boats or a small fleet is six or seven?
I think it's small boats.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit concerned about that because the commercial fishing industry would not be considered small boats by any means. And I don't see that in this scenario. As far as the second bullet goes, you know, the focus on joint management of stocks rather than switching from one regional management body to another is probably what I should say, because that's what we do now.
Right.
You know, the way I see it is having one management body that covers an entire range of a species might be a better way to go. You know, the commission does that to some extent. We have species boards that involve people all the way from Maine to Florida.
Yeah.
And to me, that might be a more effective way to handle fish that are moving all over the place, whether it's north and south or, in my mind, east. So that's what I would say to that point. More emphasis on new technology. Well, there's always more emphasis on new technology. That's included in every one because nobody ever stops trying to evolve new technology. As far as biological sampling goes, I mean we need to advance cooperation, including more fisheries dependent data, because let's face it, the fleet's the one that's collecting the biological data because there it is on a dock every day. And to the last point, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, our new ocean users that we're seeing now, they can sit at the kiddie table at Thanksgiving and be quiet. we're fisheries managers and we know, well, 20 years, Jonathan, I'm going to be long gone, so that's beside the point. But bodies like this are experts in what we do. And I don't mind observers and I don't mind the public speaking, but when it comes to managing a very highly technical resource, protein source, they can sit in the back and we can take care of business here. That's my opinion.
Great, thank you. Let's do one more. Yeah,
Tom, give it a try one more time.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay.
I guess it's not going to work.
Oh, hold on.
Nope.
Try one more.
Okay, can you hear me?
No. Okay. Sorry, Tom. I'm really trying.
We'll try and figure it out in the break and come back to folks then. So I want to just do a very quick kind of show of hands. This is just an indicative exercise. We're not necessarily going to, it's nothing particularly scientific, but I would love to just get a general sense with the proviso that I know a number of people have already said it. Adam, I know you have this kind of recognition that there are parts of the scenarios that you'll recognize as being, yeah, this sounds like today in all of these. But if you were to look at each of these scenarios or think, okay, as I go through, which one feels as if it resembles today more than any other? What I'm going to do is just call them out in turn, and then I'm gonna ask for your honesty, and you only vote once for one scenario as we kind of go around these. So as you look across all four of these, how many of you think that Ocean Pioneers is closest to describing the situation as we see it today? Anyone want to suggest that Ocean Pioneers is the scenario?
And for commissioners on the webinar, if you want to raise your hand, I can count you that way.
Okay. Let me check on Ocean Pioneers. Anyone think it's the one that's most like today?
On the webinar. One on the webinar.
Okay, one on the webinar. All right, thank you. Compound stress fractures. Which one feels like it's most like today? One. Compound. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Maybe 9, 10, 11. You
Okay.
Put your hands up.
Yeah, keep your hands up there. Yeah. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All right. Thank you. How about sweet and sour? Who people think that one is okay? And then checks and balance. I think we're at checks and balance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So that balance from kind of what we got there, which is closest to describing the situations you see it today. 1 for Ocean Pioneers, 12 for compound stress fractures, 12 for sweet and sour, 5 for checks and balance. Let me ask you the second question. Which scenario do you believe? This is where it gets tricky because I'm asking you to predict. And we don't like predictions in scenarios, but I'm going to do it anyway. Which scenario do you believe is most likely to play out over the course of the next 20 years? So where is your kind of trajectory going? Let's get a show of hands for Ocean Pioneers. 9, thank you. Compound stress fractures. 20 years into the future, is that the future that we think? 12. Okay. Sweet and sour. Who believes we'll be there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. Checks and balance. Who are the optimists in the room? 1, 2. That's right. Okay, just thank you everyone for that. That one turned out as 9 for Ocean Pioneers, up from so Ocean Pioneers went from 1 to 9 in terms of today to 2040. Compound stress fractures had 12 previously. It had 12 in this one as well. Sweet and sour had 12 previously. It now had 7. And then checks and balance went from 5 last time to 2 this time. So we'll just we'll tell you a little bit more about those in a while. Okay, thank you everyone for engaging in that conversation about scenarios. I just want to see before we take a break. Let's open it up maybe for a couple of minutes of public comment. If anyone in the room, I know we can't get anyone online at the moment, but let me just see if there's anyone who wants to comment on any of the scenarios or the conversations we've had up until now in terms of public comment.
Thank you so much. My name is Pam Lyons-Grumman, and I'm the Executive Director of Wild Oceans. And I was also a participant in the Climate Scenario Creation Workshop this June, and I really appreciated that opportunity. So I'd like to just spend a few minutes talking about the main objective that we're focused on now, which is creating those long and short-term recommendations to promote fishery conservation and resilient fishing communities. So when we were creating our scenarios at the workshop, there were groups that really worked hard to come up with situations where fishermen prevailed. You know, what were those attributes of resilience that really told those stories? And we tried to be optimistic, we really did. And where I would like to see us go now is really think more about what is resilience. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines resilience as a system's capacity to anticipate and reduce, cope with, and respond to and recover from external disruptions. Fisheries are systems. They're social ecological systems. And to operationalize resilience, we need to evaluate and plan for these fisheries holistically, recognizing the climate resilient attributes in ecological, socioeconomic, and governance dimensions. So there's a lot of literature out there about what are these attributes of resilience. So socioeconomic resilience, some attributes, the ones we've heard the most about: flexibility, adaptability, organization, governance resilience, responsiveness, participatory, accountable, and then ecological resilience, diversity, structure, connectivity. Discussions so far have really focused on the attribute of adaptability, of science, of managers, of fishermen. That's the key to resilience. But we really need to inject ecosystem resilience into the discussion of fisheries resilience. For example, connectivity within fishery populations, between habitats, through species interactions is an essential attribute of ecosystem resilience. And through food web connections, an ecosystem's energy cycle is maintained. Forage species, which the Commission manages some very important ones, constitute a vital link in the marine food web by consuming plankton and other small marine organisms and transferring this energy up the food chain. But the East Coast forage complex is undergoing unprecedented changes, and we've all seen it. We have climate change winners and losers emerging. Discussions about forage fisheries are typically made in a single species context, without much consideration for the status of other species that comprise the forage base. And we currently have poor ability to predict population level effects of forage removals to predator species, to predict either the direct or indirect consequences of different harvest levels, or to evaluate the ecological impacts of developing new fisheries for forage species. So going forward, strategies for monitoring and conserving an ecosystem's forage complex as a whole. This is just one example of maintaining ecosystem connectivity. But looking at that forage space as a whole, meeting the conservation and management needs of each species would serve to fortify trophic pathways that are vital to sustaining all of our fisheries in the face of climate change. So these strategies could include forage-based indicators that inform management decisions, tell us when things are good and when we need to react. We also really need to think about these emerging new fisheries. Some of our forage fisheries, just quite honestly, they might not be available in the abundance that they were, and fishermen are looking to switch to new targets. How do we evaluate that? Those predators are facing the same issues If it's not available to the fisheries, it's probably not available to predators. New forage fishes are moving in. How do we know when we can develop a fishery, and what criteria are we using for that? So these are just a few ideas going forward. Of course, it's a longer conversation, but I would really like to see the climate scenario initiative start moving towards discussion of ecological resilience and fisheries as a whole system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional public comment? Thank you everyone for that conversation. We're going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we're going to continue the discussion, not in terms of scenario specifics, so we're not going to go through each of the 4, but now we're going to think about what patterns we've heard and what are some of the important issues that we want to make sure get continued in the discussion as we go towards the summit. Okay, so thanks everyone. Let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll resume. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. We're going to restart for the second half of our conversation here. We look as if we might have figured out the technical issues with getting people online to be able to access the mics here. So I'm going to, I know there were a number of comments, whether that be public or comments from commissioners that we weren't able to get to in the first half. So let me just invite anyone, first anyone from the commission who's listening in online, if you want to make a comment about what happened in the first half, maybe there was something specifically about a particular scenario. Let me open the floor to see if anyone wants to come in on any of those. Tony, if there's anyone you specifically identify, just let me know.
And just go ahead and raise your hand on the webinar if you want to make a comment.
All good.
All good. No one has their hand up. Is there anyone from the public on the webinar that wants to make a comment?
All right. Okay, let's continue on. I'm going to now. I want to check if if we can update the screen. I want to go to this slide. Okay. All right, there we go. Okay, thanks everyone. Before we start again in our conversation, I just want to give you, I promise you, this is one slide of scenario theory, which hopefully will explain a little as to what happens now. So we've identified in this process 4 different scenarios, and as you've amply identified here or demonstrated, what the scenarios are is in some ways a platform. They're simply a tool to allow us to maybe recognize changing aspects of our current environment and to suggest some things that we need to pay more attention to now if we're going to be prepared for a future that might play out in a number of different directions. But we can use scenarios more than just being, let's say, a platform for observation. They can be ways in which we can devise plans or strategies or actions. And so what I'm going to describe on this slide is the different ways in which organizations can use a scenario framework to kind of say, this is the way in which we want to pursue a set of actions. And there are a number of different, let's say, kind of reactions to a scenario matrix. So there might be some ideas that you've heard earlier on that you would say, I've heard that in Ocean Pioneers, but I think it's just as relevant to compound stress fractures and sweet and sour, maybe to the others as well. We call those options in scenarios robust options, sometimes no regret actions. So then you pursue options that would seem to make sense in every scenario, or certainly in a number of different scenarios, or at least wouldn't hurt you too much in any of the scenarios. So one approach to building actions from scenarios is to pursue those things that you think are like no regret moves. It seems sensible to kind of address this because it's going to play out in any of the scenarios. That's what you would call those kind of robust scenarios in the center. There are times when an organization might be facing a good degree of uncertainty, and they think we don't necessarily really want to make too many big moves right now, so we'll hedge our bets, almost quite literally, and they'll make kind of several distinct bets. They'll put in place some actions that seem to work in Ocean Pioneers, and then maybe some other things that seem to work in compound stress fractures, and so on. That would be a kind of hedge your bets, and then you'd wait and see which ones would play out. If you were more confident about the future, or more confident about being able to shape the future, maybe the thing an organization would do is to say, we're going to do as much as we can to try and ensure that we're successful in a particular world. So you might call that bet the farm, or sometimes kind of setting a vision, making a clear bet that a particular future is going to happen, and do everything to make that scenario a reality. You might also mix them up. Something like a core satellite is when you place one major bet in, let's say you want to be operating because you believe one scenario is either more likely, or you think that one is going to be a particularly key one to deal with. But then you also put some bets in place when you're saying, okay, we're not quite sure whether our core scenario is going to play out, so therefore we need to have some kind of satellites or experiments going on elsewhere. And a fifth option is where you just say, maybe the best thing to do is make sure that we're presenting a worst case, and we're preventing a worst case scenario. And so that would be the kind of the way in which you deal with extremes. Now, that's a lot of theory to throw at you. What I am going to say is, for the purposes of this exercise, where we're now going to go is to focus much more on that first option, the robust option, to kind of say, what did we hear from the managers, and I think from this session, that tells us a little more about what are some of the things that we heard time and time again across each of the scenarios that feel as if they are going to be important for the Commission and councils to prepare for as we think about the next 20 years. So we're going to focus a little bit here on robust, but that doesn't mean to say that when we get to the summit meeting, we won't also have some conversations around, are there other experiments or scenario-specific actions that we might want to take on board as well. So this slide refers to what I'm going to call here recurring ideas and main takeaways. We probably wouldn't claim at this stage they are robust or no-regret moves, but they're heading in this particular direction. And so there's a list here of 9 different elements of the kind of the reactions from the managers and reactions from this group that we felt were coming up not just in one scenario, but probably in at least 2 and maybe 3 or 4 of them. Let me just go down this list so we can talk about what each of them are, and also in the manager's summary, in that 5 or 6 page summary, you'll see that the couple of pages towards the end relate and describe each of these. So firstly, each of the scenarios, or certainly the scenarios on the left-hand side, actually I will go and say each of the scenarios, they posed challenges about the kind of the current governance structure, current cross-jurisdictional structure. Participants recognized the limitations of the current structure and felt that particularly in some scenarios, it might be unlikely to work given the unpredictability that we might see. And we've already heard conversations around that today. What is the structure that would accommodate moving stocks, that would accommodate the kinds of range shifts and range expansions and migrations that we are assessing that will happen over the course of the next 20 years? We don't know the answer to it, but we think it certainly managers and you have suggested it's an important area to cover off. The second area that we saw in related fashion is what I'm going to call here the mechanics of changing management responsibilities. And there was a number of references to whether informal approaches should kind of be transferred into more kind of formal approaches. What is the kind of the nature of the kind of the transition needs to go on here? Another important area. There was a recognition also, and particularly I think on the left-hand side, making decisions with less clarity and certainty. How do managers cope in that kind of situation? what needs to be done to manage public expectations, the kind of decision making in situations of inadequate information. So lots of kind of challenges and ideas that were emerging from that. We've talked already today, and this was recognized in the other one as well, fishery management, as we see alternative and new ocean users, you know, come to the table or come to the kiddies table, whatever we want to call it, it's sure to involve more collaboration. And so the question there is, how do we react to that? And what do we need to do to kind of prepare for a future where there will be other users, whether that's collaboration, you know, with industry, with other industries and so on. So it's an important element. Data and science looms large in just about any of these. In fact, the scenario axes themselves are defined in some ways by the kind of effectiveness of data and science. So the kind of suitable balance of funding and attention in data and science loomed large in many of the conversations across the scenarios, and we need to think about that as well. And then also the current stock assessment methods and processes was something that we discussed here, and indeed it got discussed in the management meetings as well, and there were a number of questions around that. Flexibility, if there's any of these that feel as if it's a no regrets or a kind of robust move, then increased flexibility around permitting and landing was something that we heard across a lot of these different scenarios. In a few of them, especially when the ocean's getting busier, spatial planning and ocean zoning came up as important issues. And then this question of shoreside access and increased participation. We heard it a lot in the last scenario, checks and balance, but also in some of the others. And I know it was mentioned in the sweet and sour element as well. So each of these were identified both by the managers and in the managers meetings and also in the conversation that we've heard here. What I want to do for the next part of this conversation is to ask you to effectively to react to this list. Do you feel that these 9, what I'm going to call recurring issues, are they covering the most important areas that the Commission and fishery management in general on the East Coast would be thinking about and considering in an era of climate change? Are there any that rise to the top for you that are deemed to be of critical importance, so that we can address the challenges of climate change? And then also, maybe I'd love to just get a sense of if there are any aspects of actions or issues that you feel aren't on that list of 9 at the moment, but are worthy of let's say, kind of elevating into a discussion. Maybe it's something that you saw in one of the scenarios and not in any of the others. So I will leave this question up for now, and would love to take some reactions to these questions. Do you agree? Which feel as if they're kind of rising to the top of importance? And indeed, as you look across all the scenarios, are there any other additional issues that you feel are worthy of consideration? And I'm very happy to kind of toggle back to the other list if anyone requests that as well. So let me open it up for reactions to this. Joe, thank you. Let's go to you first. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And yes, can you please toggle back?
There you go.
So I just want to say how impressed I am with, as all this developed, the challenges before us, really look at how we manage resources, but also how we actually are managing people, right? And for those of you that don't know it, the reason why I was so interested in our ASMFC annual logo this year was, instead of trying to pick what fish should be on there, we had a commercial and rec fishing boat, because for that same reason, it's the people that we manage. And so I think one of the biggest questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what is our role in maintaining and increasing shoreside access? Where can we even kind of come into play there? Because we know that just allowing certain harvest levels isn't going to be enough in what's coming. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to ask ourselves as councils and council and commission members. That's going to be one of the biggest challenges, in my opinion, to be honest. You know, is the folks that are providing access to this resource.
Joe, thanks very much. Other reactions? Doug, let's go to you next. Thank you.
So I think this is a great list. The one that has always, as I've begun to work through trying to adapt to climate change and fisheries, the one that's always come to the top of the list for me is not so much that I wouldn't use the word challenges of current cross-jurisdictional structures, but the adaptability of these management structures. I think they've got to be able to be more flexible, more adaptable, so that we can effectively manage these things in an efficient way without having to go through multiple management bodies to get what we need done.
Doug, thank you. Any follow on from that or other comments on this list? Chris, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a pretty comprehensive list. The one that I've felt was pretty important is finding that suitable balance for funding science and data, especially as fish move around in the ocean. They're going to be moving into places where existing surveys just might not be suitable for picking up sampling those fish. Or in the case of recreational fisheries, the existing recreational survey may not be adequate enough to get a signal of what's showing up in these waters, either through the fact that they're just not in certain areas long enough for MRIP to pick them up, or we're just not getting enough funding for MRIP intercepts to actually get those samples to increase our chances of actually seeing fish move into new areas. But it's going to come at a cost, of course. So I just wanted to kind of just lend my support for that being one of the, I think maybe not the most important. I think you can make an argument for the other 8 too, but it's I think in the top half of that list in terms of importance. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Jim Gilmore, thanks.
So I think the key one from my perspective is the fisheries management is sure to involve more collaboration, and there, from the perspective, I think we collaborate very well, except for the one issue of history. How do we get past history? And history being that we have, our famous struggle is always allocation. So we have things that were set up decades ago, and we have trouble collaborating to get, all right, so climate change is now moving stocks, whatever, but we're stuck in we have 20 or 30% based upon a 30 or 40 year history. So how do we get past that? And it makes sense in some respects because there's economic impact for that. There's essentially 30 years ago, we built infrastructure in our state to support this. Well, it's gone now, but that's the biggest struggle I see moving forward, because we have, first off, that history that people want to hang on to. And then secondly, we even got lost. Magnuson never envisioned, the Magnuson-Stevens Act doesn't really have climate change and never figured that stocks were going to be moving. So we don't even have good statutes to help us to get past that history. So I think that's very key. We have to get into more collaboration, looking at what's happening now and forgetting history. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do that unless some law tells us we have to.
Thanks, Jim. Adam.
It's my opinion that a glaring omission on this list is trust and transparency. As I look through all of the narratives that are here, that all have the descriptions about science, the description about fishing practices, the description about alternative ocean uses. We debate here, and the fishing communities and NGOs debate the merits of all of the points that are brought to the table. Is the science actually accurate? Well, it's the best available, but scientists say it's good enough to take action on. The government says it's good enough. We decide it's good enough, but the fishing community may feel very differently. On the other hand, the fishing community may be describing a narrative about their practices, pressures, whether they're a winner or a loser in something, and you have some other group disputing that information. So without that transparency, without that level of trust there, I think that's integral to all of these narratives being successful in having positive outcomes for the resource and the fishing communities, which ultimately makes us winners as managers.
Thank you very much. I've got a number of hands up. I know there's William. Did you want to follow up directly on that one? And I know there's I'm going to go to Malcolm and Mel after that. William, is yours a direct comment on the trust and transparency?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to do is build upon maybe some of what was said in our earlier session on the importance of politics. Collaboration's just been mentioned, and trust as well. And I think it does merit being included on that list. And that's in terms of maintaining our ability to respond robustly to any of these scenarios, is the strength of our organizations. And when I talk about the strength of our organizations, I'm talking about our agencies back in our home states. I'm talking about organizations such as this, et cetera. I think all of that is built upon a foundation of having an established long-term relationship with our constituents. And it is that foundation built through the organizations that we continually work on that's going to enable us to implement these and implement them effectively. So I don't know exactly how that fits into this list, but I think strength of organizations and a commitment to that is very important.
Great. Thank you very much. Malcolm, thanks for your patience.
No, thank you. And I really do appreciate all the work y'all have done on this. These are great points for us to be considering. Along Adam's line, the transparency issue, I was looking at from a slightly different scenario, but it was making the decisions with less clarity and certainty. And I guess I can start claiming silverback status since this is my cycle meeting. So I started 19 years ago in New Jersey. And at that point, we could make very clear decisions with absolute certainty that we could change one scenario and it would alter the stock biomass immediately. Weak fish coming to mind. When we cut down on the F, then everything was going to respond. And we've come to find out that there are scenarios or there are factors that were not as accounted for back then. And we've made great progress going forward. But as we go into more climate change, more effects, and having less, perhaps more certainty about what we're responding to, but less certainty of the results, which goes back to the transparency. We're doing this on the best scenario. However, the response is not going to be that linear response that we expected 20 years ago.
Thank you. Mel?
Yeah, I was on a break. I was talking to my freshwater colleague Ross, and we were both opining about the way we kind of work in the fisheries management areas. It's like we're always driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror, because everything we do is about the past. And so part of the challenge and the system was set up as kind of a static world, but it's not a static world. It's changing. So now we're finding ourselves driving down this twisting road in front of us, looking in the rearview mirror. That's the point. I think Jim is part of that, was the past. We're always managing from the past, but somehow we're going to have to become much more agile and much more responsive to what we're dealing with in the here and now, and sort of stop looking in the rearview mirror and be able to somehow glance out the windshield every once in a while. but that's just the struggle with, that's how we do things, like a stock assessment. The stock assessment's always based on data with, from behind. And then the stock assessment takes so long to conduct, and then it takes so long to be finalized, peer reviewed, approved for management use, management acts on it, and now we're 5 years down the road. So that way of managing is just not real conducive to a changing road in front of you like it is. So it's just one of the challenges we face, but somehow we have to be more, there's got to be more agility, more timeliness to what we're doing, because it is changing. The road's changing in front of us, and we're still looking in the rearview mirror.
Appreciate it, Mel. Thank you. Cherie?
Thank you. I think I've seen this several times, and I'm still concerned about whether we're reaching all of the universe that we need to reach out to under this. Right now, we're talking about fisheries management and such, but when I think about how many around this table are affected by politics and how they worry about their jobs because politics plays such a big manner in their decisions. They might not agree with those decisions, but in order to keep their jobs, that's how they're going to vote, or that's how they're going to maneuver through fisheries management. So if the universe is not increased, if we're not including politicians, if we're not including fishers in this conversation, then I think we're missing a big point in trying to move forward in a climate change scenario. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Starr. I like what we've done, and assuming, it's an exercise, it's not going to be a new Bible, but assuming this was going to be a guideline in the future, and these are our tenets that are going to guide us. There's a lot of good comments here, but there are three that stand out to me that we have on the list that we have no control over. We don't control our funding. We do not produce revenue. We beg for our money. So to maintain stable funding is a hope. Sharing the ocean, marine spatial planning, that's out of our control. We can give advice. We can involve ourselves in a discussion. We can listen to fishermen, but we don't issue the permits. So it'd be hard to have that in our guideline. And access, we know we need access. I know in Maine, I've said before, when they were talking about rezoning the Portland waterfront, I draw too much water to take out in Wyndham. By the way, Wyndham is not on the water. But we don't control that. I mean, if we have enough money, we can issue grants to maintain infrastructure maybe, but we do not control the access points. So these are a lot of important things, but three of the biggest ones, they're hope.
Steve, thank you. Other comments? Eric Reed, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Starr. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what other people before me have said, but I look at that last bullet and I would prefer that it reads maintaining and increasing access, participation, and positive socioeconomic outcomes. Access means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I mean, we don't control how many boat ramps there are in the state of New Jersey. I don't think we do. But if you rewrite that a little bit, I think you can cover some of the comments that have been made. And generally speaking, there are people around this room who sit on management councils, and your oath is for the best benefit of the nation. And if you rewrite, in my opinion, if you rewrote that last bullet, that would help me out a little. I don't know about what anybody else might think on that.
Thank you. Let me make a couple of comments just around a few of the conversations there. Yeah, it's there's no doubt, and it's very, very useful to get the comments here around which of these of the 9 feel as if they're maybe the right ones to focus on, and then the trust and transparency, getting that in there as a 10th is tremendously useful. In terms of what we can control, I do think, Steve, that it's a consideration. In some ways, what scenarios do is they try and highlight those things you can control against those things that you've got to react to. Let's say, and you may not be able to control some of the things, but you have to, in some ways, kind of react to whether it be a change in funding or react to some other political move. And so, maybe there are ways in which, even though we may not have full influence and control, they are still important for us to, let's say, at least consider, because we've got to consider our reactions to some external force that's pushing on us. But I do very much take your point that I think there's probably a kind of priority there as to which ones can we really push on ourselves. Sheree, I just want to mention on the question of bringing in additional stakeholders, I do think that even though the scenario exercise that's happening right here is focused on the implications for fishery management, there is no reason why this scenario platform, and indeed the ideas that kind of come from it, then can't also be shared more broadly with other communities. So I hope that will certainly be the case. But you're right. The most effective scenario work gets done not by just narrow groups, but if you can involve kind of broader communities in that. So I'm hoping that this will be a platform for that too. Other thoughts on the question there, if I can just flip on to the next slide again, just as a reminder, and we can come back to the 9 if we need to. I think we've certainly got some great insight here as to what's looming largest for you in terms of importance and priority, and we'll most certainly kind of take that back, and this will now become important as we start to set the agenda for the summit. Before moving on to that last question that I want us to discuss around the summit, let me see if there's any other reactions to any of these questions over and above the conversation we've had over the last 20 or 30 minutes. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, just in the way of a question. Politics has been mentioned repeatedly around the table in various of the comments, and I'm wondering if you could just take a minute and look at those 9 and explain how you feel that it might roll into those.
Yeah, $1 million question, huh? I think without kind of running through each of them here, Bill, I think what I would say is, as we now look in more detail, maybe it's some of these rather than others, the questions that we're going to be asking are things like, so what would be potential solutions to address the problem that we've identified, or address the challenge? So we might identify a number of potential actions. We're not kind of say, oh, this is what we think we should do. What are the potential actions? Each of those potential actions then probably have to get evaluated against feasibility. And I think one of the things that you're kind of looking at in terms of feasibility is what's going to be the political realities of attaining or making the change that you're looking at. And so even you probably wouldn't want politics on this list, but clearly making decisions about what could we do, what could we push on, how could we change. If you move towards an agreement or a suggestion around that, you have to take account then of what are the politics involved in that. So please don't assume just because it's not on this list it won't be thought about. It certainly will be thought about, but in an evaluative sense later on in the process. Okay. So, Adam, thank you.
The theme of politics, knowing how much it impacts, we talked a little bit about how Cherie talked about how it might impact our decision making around the table. We know that at the federal level, it's because there's a law that mandates fisheries at a federal level. That's driven by politics. So going back to your initial slide for this section where we're focused on the robust items, but the second item there, I believe, was hedge, doesn't identifying those political challenges lead us as a policy decision to make hedge bets, knowing what some of those political challenges we face are? Wouldn't that be good scenario planning on our part?
Yeah, I think it would. That's a useful and an interesting exercise to do. And as I say, I think you would, maybe the best time to do that is when you have a series of actions that you're looking to consider or you're looking to evaluate. Then you run them through. Maybe you don't have to go through the formality of an exercise where you're identifying, let's say, 4 political scenarios, but you're probably going to have to run them through various different. Some of the time we liken scenarios to like a wind tunnel, and so you've got a prototype, which is your idea, and what you do then is you run that idea through a wind tunnel of saying, is this going to fly under a range of different circumstances? And Adam, to your point, it might well be that part of the evaluation then has to be, is this going to fly under different political circumstances? Otherwise, if we were to do it in a more kind of formal fashion, you'd almost have to say, okay, we'll identify a number of ideas coming out of this, but then we'd have to create a whole kind of series of political scenarios to go around it. You can do it probably in a sort of slightly informal fashion, but I do think it's part of the evaluation that you would have to do of the ideas that come out of this. Jason.
So the slide you had up, next one. Yeah. To kind of answer, so if I'm getting ahead of where you want me to go, you can stop me. But to answer that, the last question there, I was thinking about, you have one of the items is a stock assessment topic, but I'm not sure it quite gets at this, so I thought I'd add a couple of the scenarios have, maintain our ability or improves our ability to predict things, to kind of understand these resources. And so, we talked about both assessment tools and there was some good conversation earlier about, reference points and how those kind of change as well with the climate, which is completely true. And so that's another thing we need to continue to develop. I think we are developing tools that can account for the changing environment, both kind of the parameters of the environment, temperature and things like that, but also the spatial aspects of the impacts. So we just need to continue to develop, to start to use those tools, in a meaningful way in the process. And so that, the kind of getting ahead of it, starting to develop these tools and figuring out how to use them effectively is a hedge. That'll kind of get us prepared for, wow, our existing models just aren't working at all anymore. And so we need to kind of transition into this more progressive technique. And so the reason we're not there yet is we're not comfortable with it yet. And so we need to kind of practice and test and do all of those things. And the time for that is now. I think that stuff is occurring, but we just need to kind of have our eye on it in the context of this stuff. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, Chris McDonough, please. Thank you.
One thing that I think really applies from the list that we've kind of talked around, but no one's mentioned specifically, it was the mechanics of the changing management responsibilities. In the sense, a little higher altitude look at it in that, you've got the commissions and the councils and everyone's got to work under Magnuson or Wallop-Rowe and that set of rules and criteria. And, we're always at the lower level with assessments and other management practices, we're always adapting those to make them better. But having some of that nimbleness at the organizational level and so the way we do things. I know that's, now you're talking about legislative process, but that would be important going into the future, I think, too.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I know that a number of the conversations around this, and I think one of the prompts in underlying this one was around the need for the nimbleness and the flexibility, and in some ways that comes from a kind of degree of informality around the kind of the transitions at the moment. Questions were being asked around, so what happens at an informality? Do you need to kind of go to formal, and what are the triggers when you kind of go towards more formality? I think it's a really interesting set of questions as we try and build more flexibility. All right. Okay, I want to come on to the last part of our conversation today, and I'm going to flip on to the final slide. In some ways, we might find that there are echoes of the previous conversation, but the focus here now is we mentioned earlier. Bob mentioned it. I mentioned it. The next part of this overall conversation, after you've had a chance to talk today, after we've met with the three councils in early December, all the ideas emerging from that, a number of them will then get kind of pushed forward into a summit meeting to be held in February with a number of fishery managers from all the different organizations. So I guess questions for this group, as you reflect on our conversation here today, as you think back to the kind of the ideas emerging in the documents that you've seen, what are the big questions that this conversation raises for the Commission, particularly for this organization, that you would like to see considered and addressed at the summit meeting? And then I also want you to think about maybe some things might be more specific to the Commission. Maybe there's a second question. What are the big questions that this raises more generally for East Coast fishery management? And if you want to draw distinctions between those, that would be appreciated, because we want to get your point of view as a Commission, but then we also want to get your sense of what is maybe bigger questions. If there anything particular and specific that people think this approach or this thing should be addressed or should be considered at the summit, please let us know about any of those things. And then if there's anything just in terms of whether it be process suggestions or red flags or, oh, I think we should watch out for this. Tony, I'm sitting on the core team that are organizing the summit meeting. If there are any, points of guidance that you want to provide to us that we should be mindful of, we'd appreciate any of those as well. So there's a number of things here. This is all now taking all the ideas that you've provided us already, and we've got full recordings and notes of all of those, so very much appreciated. As we now look forward to this summit meeting where we're bringing people together from various organizations to really kind of identify what some of the potential actions are, what should we bear in mind? What's going to be important to be discussing there and have on the agenda? Yeah, I mean, I can do it. Okay, so I was going to suggest this later on, but I think it might be helpful right here. So the purpose of the summit meeting is to review the ideas and findings from these discussions, and then identify some potential actions for further consideration to really think about what is it that councils and commission should be deciding upon, considering, in order to be better prepared for climate change. So as you can see there, the kinds of actions that we're imagining will be discussed at the summit meeting, near-term and long-term priorities, maybe they'll be categorized there as to what might be some actions that individual management bodies will be undertaking. Maybe there are some multi-region or coordinated coast-wide changes that will be identified that can be put in place. Some things might require legislative change, and clearly we're into it, then they become kind of suggestions. There might be non-legislative federal policy changes that we could identify and say that could be important in an era of climate change. And then maybe whether they be policy changes or particular actions, maybe there are some guiding principles as well to evaluate further management actions in light of climate resilience and adaptability. So just to be clear, this slide is showing the kinds of categories of outputs that we would imagine emerging from the summit meeting. We're not asking for these right now. This is what we would kind of come out of the summit meeting. What we're asking you is, what do you want to put into that hopper? So that then ultimately we will come out with kind of suggestions, potential actions, and so on. So I'm happy to leave it on this slide, or also happy to kind of go back to the previous slide there, just to give you an idea as to where ultimately this is going. We're trying to narrow down, we're trying to prioritize, we're trying to say, we know this is all important. Where do we want to see potential action happening? That's what the summit meeting and beyond is about. So what should be on the agenda? What do you recommend be on the agenda at the summit meeting? Let's go to Jim. Jim, thank you.
Well, I'll start with what I said before. Maybe the question is, do we need a major revision of the Magnuson-Stevens Act? It hasn't been revised significantly since 2007, before we were dealing with changes in species distribution, abundance, whatever, due to climate change.
Thank you. Let's go to Lynn and then to Mel. Lynn?
Yeah, thanks. So just to pile on with what Jim said, I think, as we're looking at those 4 quadrants and with the Magnuson and the federal fisheries, it's this conversation about an off-ramp in Magnuson or some mechanism that gives agencies a little more nimbleness in terms of how they're managing as they're bringing in new species that they are going to have to manage in an intensive way, but they still have legacy species that they're trying to manage, that aren't as important, and they're committing resources to all of those things. At a certain point, they're going to blow because they can't do it all. So it speaks to what Jim said about just Magnuson considering a little bit how these shifting species are being handled.
Mel?
Yeah, kind of following on along with both Lynn and Jim. So we can come up with ideas, recommendations, things, but they sort of, there has to be a sense of how realistically they are within bounds. In other words, some of them might require legislative change. And so is there a commitment to that, or at least is there a willingness to accept those? Some of them might require policy changes within authority that's already exists, but there needs to be an expectation that the recommendations we come up with have a prayer. Otherwise, this is all an exercise in futility and frustration. And we get involved in things sometimes where we certainly involve the public, and the public has expectations and they make recommendations. And, we understand how frustrating it is for them when their expectations are not met, or there's a sense that, they went through all of this for nothing. So whatever we come up with, if it requires a legislative fix, a policy fix, or it's something that can be done within the existing regulatory authorities we have, whether it's council or commission, there's got to be a sense of the reality that, yes, that actually could happen, or it's within bounds.
Okay. Mal, thank you. Let's go to Cherie, Eric, and then we'll go to Malcolm from there. Cherie.
Thank you. I think when we went through the exercise of ecosystem management here within the commission, I think there was a general clearer understanding on a need to manage more based on ecosystem processes. So I'm wondering if our biggest questions and concerns is funding to maybe start migrating more towards ecosystem management, where our decisions might make more sense in a changeable climate. So funding, I look at ecosystem management as something that's pretty nascent. It's not something that's fully developed, and it might be time to just start getting some funding and getting some more buy-in from that, which would make more sense on our fisheries management decisions as a whole. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric Reed, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Starr. So I do agree that Magnuson is kind of a deterrent 20 years from now, but it is the tool we have now. It's the guidance we have now. So my question would be, is given our current guidelines and ability to manage species as individual councils or jointly with each other, how could we structure effective management with certain participants under the rules we have now? Because I honestly, every time I see a new draft of what Magnuson might look like, it scares the crap out of me. Well, there's a lot of fluff in those things, and I'm not a fluff person, in case you don't know already. So, but I mean, those are the rules we have. How can we move this thing forward, given what we have? I'm trying to think what species we all manage. Two councils and the commission. All I can think about is spiny dogfish, which I prefer not to think about. But there may be a way to do this effectively under our current regime. So I think it's worth looking at.
Thank you. Malcolm, next please, Malcolm Rhodes.
It echoes somewhat on what Cherie was saying, but the first thing that hit me is we need to have a very steady funding source. I've seen over the years where surveys we relied upon were not funded, or we're scrambling for them, or we're trying to get the private sector to pay for the funding of it. And so whether it's political or it's legislative, but to have that constant funding that we can count on, and hopefully at an increasing level, because we're going to be having to be more nimble. We're going to have to buy into the new technologies to try and figure out whatever spatial dimensions change or biomass changes. But, while we have a fairly constant budget, we still have some uncertainty year to year, and it's affected a lot of our species management over time. So, just a very constant funding, and I don't know where that starts, but it's going to need to be across all the boards and commissions and councils.
Thank you. Adam, next please, and then to Mike from there.
So thank you very much for remembering my name this afternoon. I appreciate it very much. Hopefully it doesn't cost you any sleep knowing you'll get to see me at the Mid-Atlantic Council in Annapolis next month. My hat off to you and all the team that's worked on this document so far. I think it's a tremendous asset to facilitating this conversation here today. With regards to the specific questions that are here on the screen, again, going back to one of my earlier comments that started this afternoon off, one of my specific recommendations for consideration at the summit is to make sure that people are in a mindset of the information, the ideas they're giving us are viable in a two-way street. not just in a warming environment, not just in a northward migration, not just in an offshore migration, because if in 2040 we're in a southward migration, an inshore migration, a cooling, we need to be able to use those tools. Otherwise, we've just wasted 2 decades. With regards to what the core team should be mindful of, one of the things that I struggled with a lot as I read through the document, and Doug mentioned that he felt that checks and balance was where we've been. And in fact, I raised my hand to where we are after having said that during the compound stress fractures, I felt I could relate most to those texts. So what I would suggest is what the core team should be mindful of is that this executive part of the summary, again, all of the other paragraphs that go along with it aren't the inherent outcomes of those. So I went along with checks and balances is where we are because I believe good science, smart collaboration, and tolerable conditions allow East Coast fisheries to cope with the challenge of climate change in 2022. I don't even have to go to the 2040. But when I go through and look at the text there that says successful evolution of commercial and recreational fisheries was only possible because of changes in management that provided for a full and flexible, balanced use of available stocks, we are clearly not there. So all of those other outcomes that come from these, I don't think we can just make the assumption that that's what's going to happen because of where we think we are in the matrix. So I think that's something the core team needs to give some thought to, how we balance and how we use that information for the summit.
Adam, thank you. Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I really have appreciated a lot of the conversation, particularly around Magnuson's things that could be tightened up. One of the values that I've really come to appreciate from the scenario planning exercise is trying to think of Magnuson as an opportunity. What would we need to have changed if we realized some of these scenarios, and kind of using that as a future state planning exercise, and then really trying to be proactive. You know, one of the things that I think often happens with reauthorization is that it's very reactionary, right? People complain about things that don't work well in the act, whether those are constituents or if it's bodies like this, and those are the things that percolate up, but it's not often completely proactive. So using this grid and these scenarios as a way to think about, well, what tools would we need, right? And I've heard governance kind of bubble up, and how would that be structured? Is there value in having guidance come out of the act for something like that or not? Is it something that bodies prefer to have as an internal process rather than a statutory constraint as it gets described now? So I think there's a really good opportunity to think in those terms, you know, whether you're talking about Magnuson or you know, how you construct a fishery management plan to be responsive to those kinds of things. I really valued the conversation around that and took a lot of good notes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. What's John?
Thanks, Jonathan. Since we're talking about changes that are going to be pretty extreme that we're looking at, I think we should look at extreme solutions in terms of the way we manage things. If anybody set out to set up a fisheries management system, I doubt it would look like what we have now. It's ridiculous. We've got the individual states. We have ASMFC for state waters. We have this 3 councils, and then you throw in the National Marine Fisheries Service on top for some other things. I think a way that we could eliminate some redundancy, save funding, and be much more nimble, of course, because some of the problems we have now with the moving stocks is the kind of guarding the turf that goes on between these various bodies, is to kind of blow it up and come up with something new to adapt to the current situation. Obviously, that's legislative, it's financial, but I mean, clearly we've seen some of the things that are happening now. I mean, I just think of like Rhode Island trying to get onto the Mid-Atlantic Council because there are species that are migrating up to New England, but because that requires legislation, you know, they don't have a voice in that. So, you know, those type of issues would be much better solved if we had a whole different structure.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Jim and then to Jason. Jim Gilmore, thanks.
Yeah, it's actually just following up what John said, but really at Mike Ruccio's comment. I understand the concept of, it's a chicken and egg thing. Do you let the council, we all decide what's the best thing and then change the law, or do you change the law to dictate to us? Now, if you remember, we all met probably a decade ago, the council commission, whatever, and we came up with one, and this was hosted by NOAA Fisheries in DC, and we came up with the one problem we are going to face in a decade is the council structure, because when the stocks move and because you have got priority for each council, we're going to be in a box, and the commission structure was better. So we made that comment and nobody wanted to touch Magnuson. So I agree with you in concept, but I think the reality is that we're going to have to change Magnuson and not be guided by, we already tried it, and I think it's not going to work if we try to tell them how to fix it again. That's just my opinion.
Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, I'm going to stick with this theme as well. And I think, just sort of building off what folks are talking about, an important thing that could come out of the summit, or maybe it's a subsequent step to the summit, but what are some models? What is it? One big mega council across, North Carolina North, or some other version of that, but just having some specific models that can then be tested or thought about, like how do you make that happen? Does it take a change to Magnuson? Whatever the levers and things that you have to pull to kind of make those happen. But we talk about this a lot, and I think everybody has kind of a concept of what this new thing looks like, but I bet they're all a little bit different. So just getting on the table here's one model, here's another model that can achieve that same goal. And I'll extend it away from just the governance structure to the permitting structure as well. Like flexibility comes up a bunch through the slides that we went through. And so how do we get there? Like, what does that look like? Let's build that model as well, and recognize the fact that it's funny that it comes up here so much, because everything we're doing is the opposite. It's like compartmentalizing and putting people into smaller and smaller boxes. I think because we believe we need them to be in very small boxes to understand, but I don't accept that premise. And so just kind of recognizing that the current momentum is going in the opposite direction of flexibility is important, recognizing that. And then what are the models? Like, what's a flexible permit look like? I bet it's not, a permit category with 15 subcategories in it. It's probably something simpler than that. Thanks.
Thank you. Doug, let's go to you next. Thank you.
Just going to reiterate some of the points that Jim and John and Jason have all been talking about, as I continue to believe that's the major thing that we've got to get at. We have 4 management bodies, each with existing primary or secondary management responsibilities or co-management responsibilities. The way where we need to go is some kind of nimble mechanism to adjust these responsibilities to reflect changing resources and fisheries locations. One way to do it is to blow it up and put it back together. That could be a tall order, but I also think we could possibly look at some models where maybe simple changes to the policies of these organizations, or maybe rules and regulations, if you're looking at the commission, might be able to accomplish something close to or similar to what blowing the place it up would accomplish. I'd still think blowing up would be the best, and put it back together would be the best, but that may be a real tall order.
Thank you. Any Any additional thoughts on this, Mike? Over to you. Thank you.
I can't help myself. I like to have fun at meetings. So what I'm hearing is blow it up, give full control to the federal government, right? No, I'm just kidding. No, I do appreciate though the conversation on that, and just like you guys would get a kick out of saying give it all to the feds. I know that's not widely popular anywhere, but particularly here. So thanks for indulging.
Okay. Thanks everyone for that. I'm gonna go to public comment in a moment or two to see if anyone has something that they want to add to the last couple of questions, both kind of the overall summary of sort of common recurring themes and then ideas about the summit. Let me just make a couple of comments. I won't go into the kind of specifics of it, but what I really appreciated about that conversation was the idea that the really valuable conversations to happen at the summit are going to be in some ways envisaging different models, whether that be envisaging different models of permanent flexibility or envisaging different models of governance. And so kind of almost thinking about what would be some of those prototypes that we would just imagine what could kind of come out after a change. So I think that's exciting, and I'm glad that we've got that kind of encouragement from you to think in those terms at the summit. I'm sure there'll be many other things that we'll want to be dealing with as well. But they're really good pointers for us. Thank you. Let me open it up and Tony, see if there's anyone online who wants to make a comment either from the commission or anyone else. Or indeed in the room, if there's anyone that wants to make a public comment. Yeah, yes, sir, please. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Thanks.
Yes, thanks.
All right. Well, good afternoon, commissioners and board members. While I know many of you, and it's nice to see familiar faces around the table, for those I have not met, my name is Kirby Roots-Murdy with the U.S. Geological Survey's Eastern Ecological Science Center. I have appreciated being able to listen in to the conversation and comments offered around the table today, and it's clear that a lot of important points have been raised by this process, and I look forward to seeing how the summit is convened in February of 2023. I would offer for your consideration that we have leaders in the field of decision science and analysis that following the summit in February, there could be a role for our scientists to serve in helping to work through those next step decisions and weighing the interests of different stakeholder groups. As Tom O'Connell, Director for the Eastern Ecological Science Center, mentioned at the ASMFC annual meeting last year, our center is aligning USGS investments with ASMFC management needs to produce actionable science, as well as provide complementary science support to our federal and state partner agencies. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Bob, yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. Just two quick comments. One is that the notion of constant funding has come up, and I think we need even better than that. We need almost continually increasing funding. Constant funding has got us where we are. We're losing surveys. We're losing legs of surveys. We're decreasing biological sampling. So I think we need to find, if we want to be able to really predict what's going on with these stocks, we need to find a source of funding that kind of tracks along at least with inflation and maybe a little bit better. So that's one thought. And the other thought is, during the summit, I think it's probably worthwhile to have some conversations about, who makes a decision on implementing. Once we have some scenarios and paths forward, you've got three councils, you got the commission, you got the federal government, you got all these pieces, and which one of those groups picks where we go from here, and how they, which one of those scenarios or which one of those courses to move forward is actually implemented. And I think that's going to be a really important piece of the conversation, because we could come up with something that the commission really loves, but maybe the council doesn't, and you can't move forward with that, or the opposite, or one council likes it and two don't, or whatever it might be. And I think it would be great if we could figure out sort of where we go in the family, if you want to call it that, amongst the councils and commissions and with NOAA's help. But, will it need a legislative push to get us over the top? I think is worth, having that conversation during the summit on where do we go from here? Just because we have scenarios, then what? What do we do with them?
Bob, thank you. Yeah, certainly I should have said this, the scenarios are just a means to an end. You have the scenarios, and as you say, the kind of the important decisions, the important conversations kind of start then. I appreciate it. Jay, let's go to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commission Chairman and everyone else for all your attention on this topic. And I just have a couple quick thoughts, general thoughts. I'm really studying this a bit and talking to a lot of folks and attending that scenario creation workshop, what I've been hearing. And it seems pretty clear that we're going to have to get pretty busy now doing a lot more of the things that we're already doing and some new things if we're going to have this 2042 that's anywhere near that upper right quadrant where we might want to be. And trying to generalize a little bit, I mean, expanding and modernizing our data systems, much more enlistment of recreational and commercial fishing folks in data collection, continued investment in the science to deliver data at the temporal and spatial scales that it's really needed for specific decisions. And something like a moonshot for habitat, for how we identify, restore, and conserve it. Like, so on the data piece, that includes the fishery independent and the fishery dependent data. And so the ideas that people have been getting excited about include really building out the ocean sensing network through more sensors on the offshore wind that's going in the water, through expansion of the ocean observing systems. We have 3 Cracker Jack shops on the East Coast, Nearacus, Maracus, and Sakura. It's going to take a lot of hands working together as they're already doing, but ramping up that coordination. More bottom-up support. Government's not going to be able to do this alone. There's not going to be enough public money. So like the approach, the idea of something like the Northeast Study Fleet, looking at what worked and well or not with that and thinking about how we might move towards a more of an effective coast-wide network of sensing that's, that with the incentives right, that industry and all the fishing folks really want to contribute to it because they understand something about how the data is being used and maybe agree with that. I'm dreaming, okay. Science and technology, it's been brought up a lot, but really there's so much, about leveraging new technology like AI, as has been said very aptly, the metaphor of shifting the focus from the rear view mirror, which all of fisheries science is really based on, to these the ideas like the state-based models and really looking through the windshield is I think where we want to be rolling. And, investing in the forecasting ability, we're getting better and better. We've all seen the papers. It's unambiguous that the ranges are shifting and that the productivity of critters is changing. But the ecology, what happens when with these novel communities is still, I think, an urgent frontier. For example, there's an example of that, the sort of plausible and documented theory of that the demise of pink shrimp in the Gulf of Maine, it was the hot water, but it might have been a thermal expansion of the habitat for squid during an ocean heat wave that really kicked them when they were down. So and finally, management, or almost finally, has got to be more nimble. We've got to go faster somehow without compromising the transparency and and the public oversight, because the cliche, which is true, of change happening at the speed of trust. We need a lot more of that. We need to figure out how to build it. And then the last thing, which is really what I think all this would have been part of the conversation already, but I haven't heard much talk about habitat today, and so I really wanted just habitat to be part of this conversation going forward. We talk a lot about how the fish are moving. Well, why? They're only moving because the habitat that makes fisheries even possible is moving. So the work there's a lot of really important sort of cutting edge work that's getting ready for prime time that's being led by the Mid-Atlantic Council on dynamic approaches to understanding habitat. And would love to see, we would love to see more of that. So and there's the talk about MSA authorities. The more you can move towards clarity about well, we can't do something because of MSA. Is that within the fisheries realm, or are we saying we're not really going to get to a future we want unless we have massive upgrades in how we take care of the water quality flowing into our nearshore systems and estuaries, and that's well outside of Magnuson authorities. I feel like having some clarity around that will be good too. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me see if there's any other additional comments from the commission or any other comments. Tony, anything online? No raised hands. All right. Well, Bob, I'll hand it back to you in a moment or two. Thank you, everyone, for your preparation, your contributions, your conversation this afternoon. I'll speak, and Tony, I don't know whether you want to say anything on behalf of the core team. We very much appreciate all of these ideas. As you say, as we said, it's part very much of a kind of a process where we're all learning, we're all kind of contributing things. And then, and I think the ideas that have kind of come up today will be very much in the mix as we think about the next steps of this in terms of the summit, and of course with many kind of probably decisions and processes to go beyond that as well. So thanks again for your time today. I appreciate it. Tony.
I just want to thank Jonathan for coming to the meeting. I don't think I could have done this without him. He's been essential to the core team, and just that the core team is really excited as we move through these conversations with the commission and council. We have dedicated a lot of our time to this work with Jonathan, and we really do want to see outcomes coming out of this process. So keep it coming. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, just to wrap up, echo Tony's thank yous on behalf of all the commissioners here. We appreciate you shepherding us through this process. As I said at the workshop over the summer, if this stuff was easy, it would have been done a long time ago. We wouldn't have to go through this long, pretty complicated process and work through it as we have been. So, there's still a lot of work ahead. Jonathan, for better or for worse, you're going to see some of these faces at your South Atlantic, Mid-Atlantic, and New England Council meetings. There's still a lot of work to be done. We'll send 10 commission representatives to the summit that's happening in mid-February. So if anyone's really dying to go to that and participate, let Spud know. He's going to make the decisions on who gets to go. He's the chairman. But other than that, again, thank you. Thanks everyone here for their time and their thoughts today. I think we're making progress and we're coming up with some great ideas. We just have to, get to where the rubber hits the road and wrap it up. So thank you for that. And in closing, dinner is at 6:30 tonight. Jonathan, if you're around, you're welcome to come. And it's just outside.